Thanks so much, Roger, and thanks to TASA for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I acknowledge their continuing sovereignty. So today's talk is based on a paper that was published online in the Violence Against Women Journal in 2023. The findings that I will be discussing draw from my doctoral research project. This was a qualitative study that sought to really investigate how women with insecure migration status in Australia experience, respond to, and access formal support for family violence. Today, I want to focus specifically on the ways that women's migration status impact how they experienced or their vulnerability to family violence following the move to the country. And also I'll briefly touch on how this impacted their ability to seek help in Australia. But specifically, I want to discuss how I used the idea or the concept of precarity as a lens to interpret women's lived experiences. And I will end by reflecting on some of the implications of this approach for research and for our understanding of the specificity of violence for migrant women, but also implications for policy and practice. So it's no surprise to you all that responding to and reducing the rates of violence against women and children has really remained on the policy agenda in Australia since the 1980s, though we know responses have changed and rates of violence continue to remain high. Since 2010, federal, state and territory governments have re-established their commitment to addressing the prevalence of violence against women and their children, and we've seen the implementation of various action plans for reform. At the federal level, we have the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children, which is currently in its second phase. And this sets out a framework for action with an established commitment to addressing what are generally termed diverse experiences of violence. Over the past several years, researchers have really focused their attention on understanding the specificity of family violence for migrant women. And I see my research as being situated within this growing body of Australian feminist scholarship that examines how structural factors, such as those connected to migration policies and law, really contribute to family violence. It also sits within a body of intersectional feminist scholarship that has sought to bring migration status as a sociological category very much to the forefront in the analysis of women's lived experiences in Western industrialised countries. So this includes Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and in many respects, the US. So by focusing on women's lived experiences, this research has really shed light on the ways that yes, cultural factors, but also structural inequalities, including those that are associated with the status of immigration. And I'm quoting Professor Margaret Abraham here, who's influenced my work in various ways, how this can exacerbate the vulnerabilities associated with gender, class, and ethnicity in the context of domestic violence. I'll just provide a bit of a discussion of the present study and what this looked like. As I said, it was my doctoral research. So it was conducted in two stages. The first stage involved interviews with stakeholders who were working across the family violence system in Victoria, and I should say it was specifically a Victorian study. And many of the stakeholders that I spoke to were, well, they identified as first-generation migrants themselves. And then stage two involved in-depth interviews with 18 women who experienced family violence in Australia when their migration status was insecure. And I will explain how I conceptualised that in the context of my own study. But I did want to mention, it's hard to believe, but it actually has been quite a bit of time since I did these interviews. These were conducted in 2018 and 2019, and we know that research that has been conducted since this time, particularly work that's been led by the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre, that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated many of the issues that I'll be discussing today. And Professor Abraham and I have actually got a paper that will be soon to be published that's looking at this at the Australian and US context as well. So I now want to situate the study by looking at the relationship between migration policies and family violence. And I want to draw attention to why the migration context is, why it's important for us to foreground this in our discussions of family violence. So we know that women from diverse ethnic backgrounds migrate to Australia in significant numbers each year. For some, migration is intended to be temporary, but for others, the grant of a visa is often the first step towards permanent settlement or obtaining formal citizenship status. While in the past, individuals and families were very much able to move to the country to settle permanently, we know that the migration landscape is changing. One notable shift, and of course, this is in no way unique to Australia, but we see this manifest in Australia in very particular ways, is the prioritisation of skilled immigration. And this, as a result, has seen other forms of movement, including family reunion, become subject to increased scrutiny and regulation. Migrants who arrive on partner visas, as one example, are generally required to serve a 2-year period of conditional residency, during which time they are formally sponsored and they're unable to access most social safety nets. In addition, we also see temporary migration for the purposes of work. So as one example, to fill skills shortages or skill shortages, and study. So students, we know, continue to account for a significant proportion of all temporary migrants in Australia, has emerged as a key component of the policy landscape. And this has introduced what migration scholar Qualitative describes, and I'm citing them here, a new class of differentially included precarious migrants into the polity. Despite high rates of migration to the country, until very recently, relatively little attention was paid to the dynamics of family violence for women who are temporary. I use the term insecure, and I'll explain what I mean by this in a moment, who migrate via the planned and temporary migration programs for the purposes of work, study, and family reunion. And so really with this research, what I've sought to do is draw attention to the ways that changes to citizenship ideals and to migration policies have specific implications for women who are already experiencing or who go on to experience family violence following the move to Australia. And so to do so, I look specifically at the lived experiences of women with insecure migration status, and I'll describe how I conceptualize that now. So in defining insecure migration status, and there are different ways of doing this, I drew from the work of Canadian migration scholars or critical migration scholars, including Lewin Goldring and others. And I use it as a way to speak about the experiences of women who had a variety of statuses, and I'll just explain what these are and how I define them. So the first is dependent or conditional, and I use those terms interchangeably. So this is used to refer to, for example, sponsored partners, prospective marriage visa holders or fiancé visa holders, and that is still a category of visa in the migration system, which is interesting, and a small number of skilled migrants on provisional visas. So importantly, these visas can lead to permanence if certain conditions such as serving a waiting period are met. Temporary. So this category refers to, in my definition, primary and secondary holders of student, work, tourist, and other visas that tend to expire after a specific time or period of activity. Also included within the definition are women who are transitioning their status and are waiting on the outcome of a visa application. So this refers to bridging visa holders, and there are a range of different bridging visas with different entitlements or lack of entitlements attached to them. Those without a valid visa, so that can be due to expiry or cancellation. And interesting in the context of my study, this was often a direct consequence of coercive and controlling tactics. So withdrawing sponsorship or whatever it might be to result in women becoming undocumented. And critically, the last group or cohort are women, including permanent residents, who are unaware of their migration status. So this applied in situations where women believed that their status was dependent, even though it may have been more secure in practice. And this again was very much connected to the experience of violence itself. I did just want to discuss a bit about the women that I interviewed. So the women that participated in the study moved for different reasons. So some moved for adventure, some moved to work, and others moved to further their careers, to study, for marriage, to start a family, as well as for economic reasons. The women differed according to ethnicity and national origin. Most were between the ages of 24 and 38. They were also very highly educated, with most holding a university degree or a postgraduate degree. And importantly, women held a variety of visas, and this afforded them different legal, social, and economic rights and entitlements in Australia. So I'll just expand on this a little bit. This included how long they could live in Australia, and critically, whether they could transition their status in the future. So whether they could access permanent residency or whether they could transition from one temporary visa to another temporary visa. Critically here too was their extent of access to public goods and services. So whether they could access legal settlement, housing, financial support, and the healthcare system, as well as their entitlement to work. So we note that certain visas place limits on working rights. So although in Victoria, as in other states and territories, all victim survivors are technically entitled to seek help from police or frontline services, recognising that migrant women often don't immediately go to police for a range of reasons, migration policies and restrictions on social welfare tend to reduce the type and degree of support that women can receive in practice. Migrant women have differential access to a range of social entitlements and services, as I said, such as public housing, healthcare, legal and settlement support, as well as financial assistance. And this ranges from income supplements to single parent payments and crisis support payments in an ongoing way, which impacts the likelihood that they will be able to be housed in a refuge. And it is because of the conditions that are attached to women's visas that frontline family violence services can be restricted in their ability to support them. And this is, of course, exacerbated in instances where women have no access to ongoing income or financial assistance. If a relationship does break down due to family violence, women on partner visas and some women on prospective marriage visas can continue with their application for permanent residency in Australia by accessing specific protections in immigration law, and these are colloquially known as the family violence provisions. I will just state that last year the federal government made an announcement they were going to expand eligibility for the provisions. We don't quite know what that will look like just yet, but hopefully a positive step forward, but we will see. However, women who are not on this pathway have very limited options. In fact, women and their children who have no ongoing right to remain in the country may be forced to leave Australia if their circumstances change, including as a result of family violence, and their relationship breaks down. I won't spend too much time talking about what the violence, how it manifested and what it looked like, but I will just provide a bit of a snapshot just to contextualise what I go on to discuss. So like victim survivors from non-migrant groups, the women in the present study reported experiencing different forms and patterns of family violence in Australia. While some women reported experiencing violence prior to the move, others experienced it for the first time after arriving in the country. Women described how male partners, as well as other family members such as in-laws in Australia, but also in other countries, exercised control over their everyday lives following the move, and that this frequently involved monitoring and or controlling their access to technology such as mobile phones. And I've written about this more recently. Women also described how they were socially isolated. They just experienced economic abuse, including economic control, the exploitation of their labour in and outside the home, and also forms of reproductive coercion and physical and sexual violence. Critically, for all victim survivors, recognising that they were a diverse cohort, migration status was a factor that shaped the nature of their experiences, and this very much came through in my discussions with stakeholders as well. Victim survivors discussed how perpetrators made threats regarding their migration status, women with dependent migration status, so those on partner or prospective marriage visas as an example, experienced threats regarding the withdrawal of sponsorship, with perpetrators often using their elevated status as citizens or permanent residents against women, making explicit threats to have them removed from the country. And this had specific implications for women's safety. This looked different depending on women's individual circumstances, but specifically for mothers who are at risk of being separated from their children or who were at risk of further violence if they were forced to return home. A really important finding is that perpetrators who were sponsoring partners, so perpetrators who were permanent residents or citizens, were able to capitalize on anti-immigrant sentiment, making verbal threats to report women to immigration authorities for various reasons, even though their claims were unfounded. And I will just say that if you go to the Department of Home Affairs website, there is a phone line that you can call to report people for visa fraud. While most of these threats did not eventuate, 3 women on partner visas that I spoke to revealed that sponsorship was formally withdrawn, and 1 woman, because she was on a temporary visa, there wasn't a formal sponsorship in place. So her perpetrator was able to actually remove her and her children from the visa because he was the primary applicant and she was the secondary applicant to a temporary visa, and it was done so without her knowledge. 1 victim survivor participant who was on a tourist visa also revealed that her partner visa application was actually never formally lodged by her husband. So she was moving back and forth between India and Australia on different or successive tourist visas. And so this was never formally lodged, even though he and members of his family had made threats regarding the withdrawal of sponsorship as part of the exercise of control. And women discussed how the various ways that family violence had a direct impact on their migration trajectories and pathways, including how male abusers arranged for them to travel to Australia on tourist visas instead of partner visas, because they knew that these were associated with fewer protections. So that's really something really important to keep in mind. So although there were similarities, family violence did manifest in different ways depending on women's individual circumstances and the resources that were available to them at different points in time. In addition to focusing on the forms and patterns of family violence that women reported experiencing in Australia, I also focused on the characteristics of their everyday lives as non-citizens and, as I said, the specific circumstances that made them vulnerable. As Australian feminist scholars Jane-Marie Mayer and Marie Seagrave have argued, there is a need to challenge how vulnerability is constructed in family violence research, in policy and in practice, as while migrant women, and I'm quoting from them here, are often understood as experiencing additional barriers and vulnerabilities when they face family violence. This vulnerability that women experience is predominantly created by service and legislative regimes, and this impacts women in different ways and can limit the options that are available to them in situations where a partner is violent. And so where my work comes into this is that I suggest that employing precarity as a lens can help to highlight the ways that structural inequality contributes to women's vulnerability to family violence in the migration context. So migrant precarity and family violence, I want to explain how I approached precarity in the context of this work and how I used it to interpret women's experiences. Precarity has been used across a range of disciplines to describe a historical moment in time that is characterized by insecurity and a lack of predictability. The term has been used to describe insecurity in employment and labour relations across the global north in particular. I've drawn primarily from the work of critical migration scholars who adopt a broader approach and use precarity to describe the uncertainty and unpredictability of everyday life. Here, precarity refers to the effects of insecure or contingent migration or employment status. Researchers have considered how precarity plays out at the core of a migrant's daily existence and that it is linked to the presence or absence of rights and entitlements. It is because of this status that different groups of migrants are seen to share, and I'm quoting from Goldring and Landolt here, a precarity that is rooted in the conditionality of presence and access. And it's because of this that they can be vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and other forms of discrimination. Within the migration studies literature, feminist researchers have shown that migration status is an important marker for precarity, and I think that's a useful way of framing it, quoting Piper and Lee there, and that migrant women are susceptible to multiple forms of precarity within but also beyond the workplace. And recent research with migrant workers in North America and asylum-seeking women in Europe has also examined how precarity intersects with gender-based violence, which heightens risk to other forms and patterns of discrimination, violence, and exploitation. And this growing body of scholarship draws attention to the varied forms of precarity to which migrant women are exposed and the ways that they counter the disadvantages associated with this status in their everyday lives. I suggest that there are three components of precarity that characterized women's lives in the context of my study, and I define these as legal, social, and economic. And interestingly, it's important to note that these intersected in different ways to shape women's lived experiences of migration, but also of family violence. So I want to discuss these now. The first, and indeed the most pervasive component of precarity that women described, was legal precarity. And I use this to refer to the uncertainties that stem from a migrant woman's right to remain in Australia. The insecurities associated with women's status provided opportunities for perpetrators to use coercive and controlling tactics to threaten, regulate, isolate, exploit, and micromanage them following the move. This reduced the degree of control that women were able to exert over their own lives, including their ability to pursue the goals associated with their migration. And that was often after significant investment in relocating and investing in their lives and futures in Australia. Stakeholders spoke about the ways that the structure of the visa system, but specifically the partner visa program, creates an imbalance of power. And while they said that partner visas don't necessarily cause violence, they, and I'm quoting a participant here, allow an environment for it to get very out of hand. And in my discussions, a community lawyer explained that women can become dependent on a partner for housing, for income, and healthcare. And this is owing to the specific conditions around sponsorship. And by virtue of all these vulnerabilities and isolating factors, they often become dependent on their partner for information. And this was echoed by victim survivors who were on partner visas, who described how misinformation, for example, was used to control them, and that this formed part of a broader strategy that was used to instill fear and enforce their dependence. Women on partner visas also reported that men made threats to send them back to countries of origin or to have them deported. And this is evidenced in Gayathri's quite powerful account. She says, one of the bad things is that they already know the visa that we're holding. They have 100% rights to withdraw that visa at any time. They're using that and threatening the women, if you do this, I'll cancel you. If you do this, you'll go back. Legal precarity also impacted the lives of women who were temporary, with temporary migration status. And women described how male perpetrators use their lack of status against them. And here I've included a quote from a victim survivor participant, Christina. Christina was an international student, and she described the imbalance of power between herself and her partner, who was an Australian citizen. She said that over time, he became increasingly controlling and began to monitor her daily movements. He also threatened to report her to immigration authorities after she failed courses at university and her visa lapsed. And she explained, there was a time that I stopped studying because I failed my first semester, so I got disheartened because my tuition fee is extremely expensive. I just remembered crying because it took a while to find a job because I didn't have Australian experience, so employers didn't want to hire me. I basically had no money of my own, and I couldn't transfer to another university immediately because it was the middle of semester already. So I was sort of illegal, and he threatened to report me because I was illegal or I wasn't holding a visa then. Anytime I did something that would upset him, I thought he might just go ahead and report me or something. So quite a powerful account. Victim survivors also reflected on the process of relocating to Australia and the stresses of living with insecure migration status. And what I found was that legal precarity was really heightened in situations where both a woman and her male partner lacked a more secure form of status and were using the temporary visa or seeking to transition it and to transition onto a permanent visa in the future. And so where there was a lack of control of the couple's migration status situation, women described how male perpetrators engaged in a range of tactics to control them. Mariam, for example, explained that because of her husband's abuse, she didn't have the resources to pay for her student visa renewal. And this meant that at one point during her stay, both her and her children were at risk of losing their status and actually being put into immigration detention. And so this, in addition to her temporary status, meant that his threats to return the family home to Pakistan carried quite significant weight. And by withholding income, perpetrators were also able to exercise significant control over women's lives and their migration trajectories, including the likelihood that they would be able to retain their status and continue living in the country. And women also described how their everyday interactions and activities were regulated by perpetrators, which included male partners, intimate partners, but in some instances, this also extended to other family members. And this is something that we see in the literature as well. Women also described how their experiences changed as they moved across visas, which afforded them differing degrees of security over time. So this brings me to social precarity, which relates to women's experiences of belonging to society. Women's accounts highlight that the conditional nature of their status in Australia can intersect with social isolation and dependency to again create quite unique opportunities for control. When reflecting on their experiences of migration, many women expressed a sense of loneliness and detachment, which was compounded by their separation from family. And this impacted their sense of belonging in different ways. Fatima, who was holding a partner visa, arrived with limited social networks, and she described how her husband's control tactics instilled a sense of omnipresence. So she said, "It's so hard when you come here, there's no one here. At the time, my husband took this advantage from me. There was no one to talk to, and I was also not sharing with my family because they're so far. Even when I went to talk to the interpreter, he was always with me, so I couldn't share anything." And in this way, as Margaret Abraham has found, and my research reflects this, social isolation really heightened the ways that victim survivors were dependent on their male partners. Victim survivors who experienced violence before the move also explained that its continuation in Australia contributed to their isolation and sense of disconnection to place. And this was exacerbated in situations where a woman's right to remain in the country was dependent on an intimate partner, or where the perpetrator had made very explicit threats to send the family back to countries of origin. And I want to draw attention to Sahar's account. So Sahar was an applicant on her husband's student visa, and she explained that returning home was not a practical option for her, and would have had significant social and economic consequences for herself, but also her two children who were born in Australia. At the time that I spoke with her, she had lived in the country for nearly a decade. And in spite of her husband's violence, she had worked multiple casual jobs to provide for herself and her children. I should say that Sahar was university educated. She had postgraduate qualifications. And despite these postgraduate qualifications, she was unable to transition onto a different visa, and explained that she had few options outside of that relationship. And she recounted that she felt stuck owing to her lack of social connections in Australia, but also her fears about being forced to return home. And one thing that I highlight in my paper is that these accounts highlight that there are transnational implications that exist for some migrant women experiencing violence, which can impact their sense of belonging following the move to Australia, but it can also impact their ability to return to their lives and families in other countries. Women and professional stakeholders also described how experiences of racism and being culturally different can work against women, further contributing to this sense of isolation. And this intersected with legal precarity, which contributed to the feeling of being othered. As Gayatri explains, "We're not coming here with a lie. We're coming married. Why do they want to put us on that waiting period for so long? We're not women who are coming here just to stay here and get PR. We're coming to start our new life." And so these accounts provided by women such as Gaia 3 highlight how the experience of life in Australia was influenced by women's lack of citizenship, which critical migration scholars such as Alleman describe as an exercise in boundary drawing. And this very much influenced women's sense of belonging and provided opportunities, again, for perpetrators to regulate and deprive them of the resources that they needed to control their lives. And finally, this thing brings me to economic precarity. Economic precarity refers to women's extent of access to public goods and services, including social security and welfare, which, as I've explained, are often contingent and uncertain. It was really interesting that most women explained that they experienced a loss of social status and/or had financial difficulties after arriving in Australia, which exacerbated the effects of their insecure migration status in different ways. Their accounts also suggest that economic precarity can intersect with social precarity to really heighten dependence, and this can undermine women's experiences of freedom by limiting their resources and creating, as I said, additional opportunities for control. And what I found was that the economic interdependency that exists within families was heightened by the pressures of living without the security of permanent residency or formal citizenship status, and critically, the lack of a viable social safety net. Stakeholders also discussed how economic precarity may be unevenly distributed within the temporary migrant cohort, with women on specific visas being particularly susceptible. So many stakeholders explained that women can really be disadvantaged by the financial burden of being a student, which requires them to pay for private healthcare, their education, any costs associated with raising children, and restrictions, of course, on working rights to 40 hours a fortnight for students. And this was put back in place following COVID when this cap was lifted, which is interesting for various reasons. Women, including Mariam, who was on a student visa, described how these situations of dependency created opportunities for their partners to control them financially. So she says, I rented the house, paid the bond, paid the rent, bills, groceries, my own school fees. And when you're on a visa, you have to pay for health insurance, my son's school fees, and I was only doing a weekend job and I had some savings. When the savings finished, I started to get very depressed and worried. What am I going to do now? So while having access to their own income at different times following the move reduced the ways that women, including Mariam, were dependent on a partner, they also ran the risk of being forced into more precarious forms of work. And critically, for most women that I spoke to, this included cash jobs with irregular hours and unsafe working conditions. Mariam explained in our interview, there were too many burdens psychologically, emotionally, and physically. So I now want to move this into a discussion about precarity, family violence, and the critical issue of women's safety and security. These components of precarity intersected in different ways in women's lives and very much influenced how they were able to respond to and, of course, seek help for family violence, as well as their subjective experiences and feelings of safety. While in Victoria, as I mentioned, all victim survivors can seek help from frontline services. What I found, and as other research in both the Australian context but also internationally has also found, is that migration policies, and in particular restrictions on social welfare entitlements, reduce the type and degree of support that migrant women can practically receive. And I wanted to include one quote from a manager at a frontline family violence service that I spoke to, and this has really stuck with me. It says, the visa makes a huge difference, unfortunately, because it's the ticket to the systems. So often I found that women's support pathways, or at least the women that I spoke to, tended to be impacted by, of course, the specific visa that they were holding at that particular time when they exited a violent relationship and sought formal help or support, but also the service or support worker that they came into contact with. And what became clear was how stakeholders from different services worked with women in an ongoing way to help them navigate system gaps, to access support that was culturally safe, and negotiate a pathway to support and safety despite system gaps and without the necessary funding to do so. Some women, including those who were technically eligible for the family violence provisions, were described as having more options than others, such as holders of temporary visas or women who had no visa and had become undocumented, even if this was a consequence of the violence. So if the woman was a partner visa holder and fell out of status, the department is generally quite strict about that. It's not really recognised in terms of how the provisions operate. But critically, women were also impacted by the ways that their insecure status intersected with other factors, which influenced the extent to which they could access formal support, retain their status, and critically rebuild their lives after violence. So we see, I talk about protracted precarity that was experienced even after exiting the violent relationship. So some of these factors, and I'll be quite quick here, included whether they were able to access support in their language. This is something that's been spoken about for years, so it's not very new, but critically whether this support was culturally safe, whether they could rely on social support from their own networks, whether they had friends, family, colleagues in Australia or overseas. But what became really clear was the ongoing work of grassroots women's organisations, and I was very fortunate to be able to speak to a few of these organisations who played a key role in filling system gaps and helping women navigate the systems, and also ensuring that they had access to the material, emotional, and in-language support that they needed. So often women couch surfing, different community members offering up, a spare bed in their house, things like that. Despite being highly qualified, many of the women I spoke to struggled to find work in their respective fields, and many were required to retrain due to issues getting qualifications recognised. This included doctors, university teachers. And women who were eligible for the family violence provisions, critically, they may have been eligible, but in order to access them, they needed to have the different types of evidence that the department requires them to have in order to support their claim. And they required ongoing support from settlement services, which took months, sometimes years to resolve. And as one support worker explained to me, a woman needs to be strong enough to navigate the system, to work with us and find a way, knowing it's going to take months or years. And some women were disadvantaged to the extent that a focus on meeting their basic needs to reduce the risk of homelessness, poverty, and removal from the country prevented them from engaging in the types of therapeutic support that is really designed to assist them in their recovery and rebuilding from violence. So I realise I've been speaking for quite a while, but just to kind of wrap up this discussion, really what I've sought to demonstrate with this work is that precarity can function as a structural condition, at least that's the way the terminology that I'm using, that has implications in terms of various forms or patterns of inequality that impact migrant women's experiences of family violence in Australia. Migrant precarity also impacted women's efforts to ensure their safety and survival. I argue that drawing on precarity as a lens in the examination of migrant women's experiences can help to generate further insight into the ways that vulnerability to violence is produced by structural inequalities, including state law and policy, and that this can bring more clearly into view how violence is both facilitated and sustained by the state. And I suggest that this is also important as it can help to challenge what scholars such as Letty Volk describe as a tendency to focus on cultural practices that subordinate women from immigrant backgrounds in research and in policy. And critically, this has been shown to contribute to the ways that women are represented and the types of resources and practical supports that are made available. So while government efforts to address family violence in Australia and in other Western industrialised countries have highlighted the importance of reducing barriers for all victim survivors so that they can seek help before violence reaches a crisis point, findings from my study very much suggest that responsibility for responding to violence in the migration context involves accounting for the ways that the normative rules, policies and practices that govern access to support and who can migrate under what circumstances it continued to exclude a significant proportion of victim survivors in the community from getting the support they need. And as women's accounts highlight, state policies really exacerbated their vulnerability to prolonged or ongoing violence, as well as other forms of precarity once they had left a violent partner. And this included the risk that they would be removed from the country or be forced to return home due to a lack of resources. And this was despite their significant efforts to rebuild or build a life in Australia. So I think I'll leave that there.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for a very thought-provoking webinar. And while you're taking a breath, I'll ask people. We've got quite a few people here. Some people are clapping. If there are any questions or comments. Just browsing through it. Any comments, questions?
Renee has a question, Roger.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I just couldn't say. Oh, thank you, Renee. You might have to unmute.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I was trying to find the little hand emoji and I couldn't, so I've just put in a comment. Oh, thank you. That was really excellent. I am from the University of South Australia and I'm doing my PhD and I'm looking at the cultural representations of, in quotations, cold women, as well as interviews with women of colour that work in the front line. So this was really exciting research. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit more on how culture is used as an excuse or explanations. Was that sort of coming up, and then how you sort of reframed it to look at structural inequality? And did women that you interviewed, did they talk about sort of cultural explanations, or were they more aware of the power imbalances and the structural inequalities themselves?
Thanks so much, Renee. And please do share the findings of your work. I'd really love to hear what you find. I mean, it's such a critical question. And I guess I've been informed by the work of post-colonial feminist scholars and the way that I come to these issues. I'm really informed by the work of Adele Modelo, for example, at the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, who have done a lot of work really trying to break down how we think about culture and its relationship to violence. I think it really echoes some existing and quite persistent assumptions. I'm not quite sure, you know, there are complex reasons as to why, but I think despite, you know, the literature really, yes, we focus on gender norms and how they differ within and across cultures, how patriarchy manifests within and across cultures. We understand that it looks different, but I think there is still this persistence when we think about culture and violence, we tend to other certain communities, and you know, I would encourage everyone to read the work of Adele and colleagues at the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health. It was interesting in my discussions with stakeholders. Many of them were from immigrant backgrounds themselves, so they had really nuanced and complex ways of describing these dynamics. What was really striking was that, you know, I made quite deliberate decisions in this project. I didn't want to speak to women from the same cultural background. I deliberately spoke to women from different ethnicities, cultures, backgrounds who differed by ethnicity and nationality. And what really came through all of those conversations was the impact of the visa and the dynamics of power and control that were connected to the visa itself. And this isn't specific to Australia. It may manifest in specific ways because of the structure of our migration system. In Canada, for example, they've taken away the 2-year sponsorship waiting period. So they've removed that because they recognise just how pervasive these threats are and how they manifest in a family violence context. But we can track this internationally. So that was something that was really clear. And I spoke to women who were unknown to each other. There were different ages, different migration pathways, but this dynamic is something that continued to come up. And where women did reflect on, you know, their own cultural backgrounds, it was, yes, they reflected on how gender inequality or gendered inequality manifests, but that was different for women within and across cultures. So I do recognize that. And, you know, in my PhD, I do kind of highlight how women spoke about that. But the persistence of, I guess, the intersection between gender inequality and migration status was really something that came through in all of my discussions and conversations. I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, but happy to touch base afterwards to discuss.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'll reach out to you after this. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank
Thanks for
you
your
for that.
question.
Just as a point of, Sally, would you be able to close the slide down? There's been a request for people to be able to see all the participants, if that's okay. And at the same time, Fajana, I think it is, has a question for you.
Hi, Stephanie. Thank you for your nice presentation. It's so important. Sorry for the sound. It's the raining sound and also the thunder. So I'm Fajana. I'm doing my PhD from SCU as well. I'm looking at the spousal financial abuse among the migrant women in Australia. So your presentation and whenever the information that you were sharing, I could relate to them, and I was like, yes, yes, because I found them literally like the systematic abuse, the community abuse, and internal and outside. From outside as well. Anyway, so from my research perspectives, I'm curious to know that did you see any impact of religious narratives? Did you find any case where religion was used to control or to abuse these women? Because I'm also looking in my PhD, I'm also looking at if there is any impact or influence of use or misuse of religious narratives. So did you see anything like that? So I'm just curious to know. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for your question and really critical research. So thank you for coming and for asking, but also sharing your own research and what you're doing. I mean, I think what's really great about this space is that there's been quite a number of studies that have been conducted over the past 5 or so years. So we're really seeing the evidence base being filled by a range of work that's happening in the space. I think it's a really critical question. I would say that my data doesn't really speak to the specifics of the role of religion. I was, as I said, was really focusing in on structural dynamics, looking at immigration status or migration status as a category. So in that respect, they're the types of dynamics that my data specifically speaks to. So I can't really speak to that, but I guess that just speaks to the importance of continued work in this space and us all looking at different elements that kind of help build that broader picture of how this manifests. Definitely with respect to economic abuse, I found that that was very much tied to migration status. It was quite a nuanced picture that I was able to build from my conversations, in-depth conversations with women. So that was all different types of economic abuse and the way that that really intersected with the power and the way that migration status was leveraged. But more than that, unfortunately, I'm not really able to speak to that.
Thank you, Fajana. Any other questions or comments? I can't see any hands up at the moment, but maybe I might just ask you, Stefani, you referred to Goldring and colleagues, their critical migration material, but you had a 2009 reference. Are they still writing? And if so, what are they? What is their latest work about?
It's such a good question, Roger. Actually, they do. They have recently published quite a lot of work, and I guess it's continuing to further how we conceptualize. They use the term precarious migration status, and that's a term that's commonly used in the Canadian context, just even trying to map the different ways that international jurisdictions use terminology. It's used differently in the UK, and then in the US, we tend to see, owing to the structure of the migration system, undocumented being used, for example. So there's a lot of complexity in trying to figure out you know, what terminology to use, what applies to the Australian context. And I just felt that the work of Goldring and colleagues really is quite useful in terms of thinking comparatively, contextually, looking at specificity, but then also making that connection to the types of dynamics that play out in that system. So that was really relevant. I have read more of their recent work, and they look at, I guess, more at the lived experience within that category now. So I think the earlier work was kind of setting up the category, what it looks like, and now drawing on applied work to really conceptualize how the lived experience of that. So they look at trajectories of precarious migration status, and they talk about pathways to further security, but then also pathways to precarity and protracted precarity. So if anyone's interested in that space, I think their work is really rich, and they kind of sit at the intersections between critical migration studies and feminist research as well, which I'm immediately drawn to. So
And from the sounds of it, have a qualitative bent as well by that.
they do, yeah, which is also really rich.
Mm.